Well, a fascinating debate that was started today after an exclusive story was broken here on Sky News by my colleague Carolyn Marcus. She spoke to the New South Wales Nationals leader John Barilaro about his plans for a referendum or a plebiscite in this country on nuclear energy. The question, of course, is whether Australia is ready to embrace nuclear energy. Well, one person who knows probably more about this topic than most is a man by the name of David Paterson. He is the founder of a company called Emergent Advisory. He's also one of the founding directors of the Australian Uranium Association and a man who worked for a long time for Energy Resources Australia, the company that runs the Ranger uranium mine here in the Northern Territory. I sat down for a chat with him a little bit earlier on.
It's a great call. I think I'm certainly picking up that a lot of people are very interested in the issue, and I think that people are interested in exploring the questions and understanding the issues around nuclear power better.
There's a lot of, obviously, concern from elements of the community when it comes to nuclear power. How big a role have incidents like the ones we've seen at Chernobyl and Fukushima played when it comes to those people's fears around nuclear energy here in Australia?
They clearly affect people. Perhaps Chernobyl less so because it's, it was 1986 when that occurred. But more recently, Fukushima, I think did concern people because it's, rightly, it's a horrific thing to see happen. But I think we also know that when you look overall at the safety statistics and the environmental impact of nuclear power, it's an extremely safe form of energy, and there's an excellent track record for its operations around the world. So I don't think that, and there certainly may be people that are concerned, but I think that's part of why looking at the information around nuclear power is important.
There's no doubt those concerns that people feel are real. As someone who's worked in the industry for Energy Resources Australia, also as the founding director, one of the founding directors of the Australian Uranium Association, I mean, how does the industry go about trying to combat some of those fears?
You've really got to focus on building trust with people, not just sort of throwing facts and figures at them. So in my time working for ERA and involved in the Australian Uranium Association, we attempted to find open dialogue and engagement with people that had concerns about the industry and find ways to address the things that we had in common, our common interests. So we looked at things like environmental practices and health and safety and making sure that everybody across the industry was operating at the highest standard. And we also focused on other things that were of interest to a wide cross-section of society, things like Indigenous employment at remote mine sites, and that enabled us to get a dialogue going. And ultimately that helped to build trust and to build perhaps some of the, the so-called social licence to operate for the uranium companies in Australia.
Well, of course, you had to secure the support of those traditional owners, the Mirarr people in Jabiru, before you could get anything underway with the Ranger uranium mine. But we saw those huge protests there in the Kakadu National Park in the 1980s. I mean, do you think that you were successful in managing to turn around the opinions of some of those people who were so hell-bent in their opposition to nuclear power and uranium mining?
Well, I think so. I mean, certainly, I worked for Rio Tinto, and when Rio Tinto took over the management of ERA, we focused strongly on trying to build a better relationship with the Aboriginal community in the area around the mine, and particularly with the Mirarr. Now, I don't think they ultimately have ever changed their mind about being opposed to uranium mining on their country. But we certainly found ways to take part in constructive engagement with each other, and that might have been around cultural heritage management or employment and education issues in the town and things like that. And I think that there was an attitude of mutual respect that was established through that process in the time since those large protests that you mentioned.
Well, you speak of those large protests. In recent times, we've seen similar protests here in the Northern Territory when it comes to the onshore gas industry, also in Queensland when it comes to the Adani coal mine. Do you think there's any lessons that either the coal industry or the oil and gas industry can learn from your experience going back to those times working for ERA here in the Northern Territory about how to actually engage and deal with these people?
It's about focusing in on the things that are really important to the communities in which you operate. And I think in the past the mining industry has fallen into the trap at times about just talking about big macro issues like taxes and royalties and their contribution to the overall economy. It's worked better for the mining industry when they're focused much more on the communities in which they're operating and the people that are directly affected by mining. I think that is definitely the way to build your social licence to operate in the resources sector.
Just back on this proposal from John Barilaro, I mean, do the economics of nuclear power in this country stack up? Because, you know, I've heard a lot of criticism, particularly from environmentalists, those who support renewable energy, that say that the costs just don't stack up now for nuclear energy, that renewable energy is cheaper and that therefore, you know, this is a pointless exercise to go down this path of pursuing nuclear energy in this country.
I think it's a much more complex picture than some of those people that you mentioned would indicate, and I think that's why we need to look closely at the economics in Australia for the industry. And I think there are some data points out there that we can look at that would indicate that nuclear power is a viable option that should be looked at closely. I think in 2016 in South Australia there was a Royal Commission into nuclear power. And one of the things that they found was that in a zero emissions environment, nuclear power certainly became economic. So, you know, if Australia wanted to move to a position where there were zero emissions from the electricity generating sector, then, you know, nuclear power becomes viable under those circumstances. I think we can also look around the world and look at, for example, at Germany, where they've invested heavily in renewables and they've been closing down their nuclear power sector. And that's led to, well, the twin outcomes of rising carbon emissions, ironically, and sharply increasing power prices, so the worst of both possible worlds. And so I think that it's quite possible to conceive of a situation where, in moving to dramatically reduce carbon emissions, that a combination of solar and wind plus nuclear may be the most economic arrangement.
And what about this idea of a referendum or a plebiscite on nuclear energy? Do you think that it's something that our politicians are likely to support? And if they did support it, you know, do you think there's any prospect that the Australian public would vote in favour of nuclear energy here in Australia?
Well, I think before we get to that point, I think we should be, you know, having a well-informed, evidence-based discussion around all of those considerations around nuclear. I don't think you'd want to rush into a referendum because I think you would just see the issue politicised, and I think you'd see more heat than light generated, if you like. So I'd be favouring more going down the path of really exploring the issues and having a good, open, well-informed, evidence-based discussion about nuclear power.